Hello, it's a great pleasure to be here today at the MENA Energy Meet. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. I'm James Watson, the Secretary General of Eurogas. Eurogas is one of the leading gas associations in the European Union. And indeed, today I'm going to be looking at the future of natural gas in Europe. I have a presentation that I would like to share with you, and I hope that you'll be able to see and understand for yourselves how we in Eurogas see the future of natural gas in Europe, and how we also believe that the market will evolve in the coming years. So I hope that you are able to see the slides that I'm going to share. Just a little bit about Eurogas. We are an association of companies and associations covering mainly the wholesale market, the retail market, and the distribution system, 2.2 million kilometers of pipes. So indeed, we do have a very strong interest in what will happen to the natural gas system as the current years move on into the future decades. And I think a good place to start for this discussion is always to have a look at perhaps what one of the leading authorities on energy in the European Union, the European Commission, think will be the likely future for natural gas between now and 2050. And so we start with the European Commission's vision for gas to 2050. And you will see from looking at this chart that at the moment, in gaseous fuel terms, it's very clear that there is a majority of about 97% natural gas currently being used in the European Union. The 2015 figure is not so different from the 2020 figure, I can say that. And as you'll notice as well, by 2030, the forecast is that there's only a slight reduction in the amount of gaseous fuels that would be used, and a slight reduction in the amount of natural gas that would be used. However, the European Commission, since it produced this vision at the end of 2018, has indeed decided that the objective should be carbon neutrality by 2050, something that we in Eurogas also support. But we will also have a look at our own vision in a moment to see how we would get there. But if you look at the European Commission's vision, only two of the scenarios that they produced actually achieve their own objective of carbon neutrality now. That's the 1.5 tech and the 1.5 life scenarios at the end of that bar graph. What you will notice is that there is a considerable reduction in the consumption of gaseous fuels according to this vision between 2015 and 2050. In 1.5 tech, there's a reduction of around about 30% in the overall consumption of gaseous fuels. Nevertheless, this is not a bar chart that is the same strong blue color as the 2015. This is a bar chart that shows a phenomenal mix of gases that would be consumed in Europe in 2050, and only a small rump of natural gas, probably equating to a reduction of about 85% from the current volumes that are consumed. I also just mentioned out of interest, the CCS, carbon capture and storage, is required in both the 1.5 tech and the 1.5 life scenarios. In fact, it's impossible for the European Commission to achieve the objective of carbon neutrality by 2050 without using carbon capture and storage. On the next slide, you see our vision for energy in 2050 compared to the European Commission's vision for energy in 2050. And I think the first and most striking difference is relatively obvious, and that is that the light blue chunk at the bottom of these bar charts is much bigger towards the left-hand side, 2017, 2030, 2050, including Eurogas, compared to the 1.5 tech scenario that we are looking at here, that the European Commission have developed. Now, Eurogas itself did not come up with this vision alone. We did work with DNVGL. DNVGL is an international consultancy with a very, very good cost optimization model. And indeed, they plugged in their inputs. And so we were able to make a comparison between the European Commission's long-term strategy and the 1.5 tech scenario and a Eurogas scenario, as we'll call it, that DNVGL produced for us. And so what you're looking at here when I say Eurogas 2019 is in fact a model that was run by DNVGL to have a look at what other potential pathways we could have to 2050 rather than just the European Commission's vision being paramount. And I think you'll see, as we see it in 2050, there's probably about twice as much natural gas still in our system compared to the 1.5 tech of the European Commission. And so we still see a relatively robust natural gas market within the European Union. Its uses indeed may also be very similar to what we have today. And I will go through this presentation and show exactly what we have in mind and where we see the gas being used in the future. In the next slide, I think it's also very important to establish that what we're actually looking at in the Eurogas scenario is delivering carbon neutrality in exactly the same way that 1.5 tech does. And although we are also delivering the same objective, we have a completely different mix of energies in the final demand. In fact, there is more of a confluence or convergence between gas and energy rather than the divergence that the European Commission shows between electricity and gas. So we have a convergence in energy, particularly between electricity and gas, to achieve that carbon neutrality, the green lines being the Eurogas lines and the blue lines being the European Commission's line. There is, of course, energy efficiency. We're both seeing around 30% drop in energy consumption in the European Union by 2050. We do see an uptake in electricity. And of course, this only makes sense as long as the electricity that is produced is, of course, decarbonized. The interesting part, that is the main difference between our studies, is that, in fact, this more convergent approach, this more sector integrated approach, saves the European taxpayer about 4.1 trillion euros in subsidies compared to the 1.5 tech to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. And that's more than the annual GDP of Germany. So this is a considerable amount of money that can be saved by adopting policies that would drive more of a convergence. To come back to the natural gas market a little bit, the next slide shows in more detail that breakdown that we have for gaseous fuels in the Eurogas scenario. And I think that it's fair to say that we do indeed envisage a reduction in the amount of natural gas that will be in the system by about 35% between 2017 and 2050. Nevertheless, that loss of natural gas is recompensed by the use of biomethane, which is going to account for about 16% of gaseous fuels in 2050, and hydrogen, which accounts for about 30%. And indeed, we see a slight increase in the use of gaseous energy by 2050 compared to what we currently have in 2017. Another interesting element of this is that, as you see on the right-hand side, the gaseous fuels that we use are increasingly decarbonized. As we have penetration of decarbonized and renewable gaseous fuels, you are able to see that by 2050, we will have achieved an 89% greenhouse gas reduction emissions from natural gas and gaseous fuels that we use in 2050. If we coupled CCS to biomethane and biogas, we would probably be able to achieve 104% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from the use of gaseous fuels. So as I said, this is a scenario that is fully aligned with carbon neutrality in Europe in 2050. But for our money, with 55% of the gaseous fuel still being natural gas, we still see this as a relatively positive natural gas scenario for the European Union. Now, one of the things that is, of course, striking, and certainly you see a lot more hydrogen in our scenario than you do in the European Commission scenario, is the fact that we do believe that we will be seeing hydrogen coming on much faster than even the European Commission do. In the next slide, we're just looking at how we see the development of that hydrogen. Indeed, in the light green, you will see the forecasts we have for production of hydrogen from renewable electricity, and the dark green is the production of hydrogen from natural gas with CCS. As you'll see, that we expect quite a large amount of hydrogen to be pre-produced by 2030. Indeed, probably almost 3 times as much as the European Commission are foreseeing. By 2050, we also see considerably more hydrogen being produced and used than the European Commission. And indeed, the volumes being produced from natural gas and CCS are more than twice the size of what the European Commission have. In any case, whichever scenario you look at here, it's clear that natural gas and CCS have a very important role in delivering the hydrogen that will be consumed in the European market. One thing that is clear as well, if you look at the blue side, the blue bar chart, you are able to see, the blue columns, you are able to see that indeed demand is being driven initially in the manufacturing sector. And I think that's important for us to maybe in the next slide have a look at exactly how we see that uptake in the manufacturing sector over the next 30 years. As I said, it's very clear that manufacturing is going to be one of the main places that we will use hydrogen in the coming years. And compared to the European Commission's 1.5 tech scenario, the European Commission's long-term strategy 1.5 tech scenario, you can see that we actually have a reduction of natural gas compared to them in 2030, but a big increase in the amount of hydrogen. Now, in terms of consumption of natural gas, it's not necessarily the case that therefore we have less consumption. It's just that that natural gas is already being applied to CCS to be able to produce hydrogen. So indeed, our gaseous fuel uptake is similar to the European Commission. It's just that we see hydrogen driving things much quicker than the European Commission do, as we believe that CCS will be able to be deployed in the 2020s. It's actually very interesting as well, because in the end, what we were able to see is that by actually making this breakthrough for hydrogen in the European manufacturing sector, this can drive the uptake of hydrogen and therefore drive the investments in the infrastructure that will be needed for hydrogen in the 2030s onwards. It's also important to mention again that these two scenarios, the Eurogas scenario is considerably cheaper for the manufacturing sector than the high electrification scenario that is put forward by the European Commission in industry, which of course will have a very important impact on the overall competitiveness of European industry. And so we would see our approach as one that is more sustainable. A little bit more about CCS here. You'll be interested to see that both of the scenarios use CCS to a large extent. The interesting thing about the lower graph, which is the 1.5 tech scenario, it appears that CCS is taken up sooner, but begins to tail off towards 2050. And this is in line with the European Commission's rhetoric that CCS and natural gas would be a transitional energy fuel. In the Eurogas scenario, we see a slower uptake in certain areas, say for power and for production of H2, but it quickly starts ramping up and indeed is increasing up to 2050. Now, we may be able to agree as well in Eurogas that hydrogen produced from natural gas plus CCS is transitional, but our general view is that we don't think it'll start phasing out once the investments have been made until sometime considerably after 2050. And thus, we see no reason to presume that there would be a reduction in the use of it. And therefore, we would say that indeed, we see that it's going to be important that we have natural gas delivering CCS for a considerable amount of time into the future, decades into the future. The other interesting fact from this is that although we have a much higher use and share of natural gas in our scenarios, we actually use less CCS than the European Commission do to 2050 to achieve that carbon neutrality. This doesn't exhaust by any stretch of imagination the amount of storage capacity that is available. And indeed, by 2050, we'd still have almost 150 years of storage available for future generations to utilize carbon capture and storage. So I think it's entirely plausible that rather than agreeing with the European Commission's 1.5 tech scenario that natural gas plus CCS would start tailing off, we think that in fact would probably stay relatively robust into 2050 and beyond. In any case, whichever way you want to go, in Europe, if we're going to achieve carbon neutrality, the very simple point and message I can give you here is that CCS is not an option, it is a necessity. We will need CCS, and if we don't use CCS, we will be unlikely to achieve our objectives in the European Union. Very briefly, just in relation to how the European gas system will evolve, the network, it's highly likely that between 2030 and 2050, we will see more dedicated pipes for hydrogen evolving from a blended scenario, so a step-by-step approach. The natural gas infrastructure will be the first place that hydrogen will be injected into. And then as time progresses, we imagine that infrastructure to develop, the investments to take place, and that by 2050, we will be shipping a fair amount of hydrogen in the pipes around Europe. This is a common view of both Eurogas and the European Commission. The only thing that's different is the amount of gases that we see, gaseous fuels we see in the systems in 2050. In terms of cost, I think it's important that we just make a slight thought about what things cost. And people always worry, I mean, we talk about competitiveness of industry. I mean, what is the cost of these new gaseous fuels? Well, I think that what we can say is that in general, today, say around 2017, natural gas is euro per megawatt hour price was probably on average across Europe somewhere around 20 euros, maybe 2025. So indeed, at the current time, the other forms of gaseous fuels that we have remain considerably more expensive than natural gas. However, as we see carbon price coming into play, we do think that indeed there will be a time when things like natural gas plus CCS will become competitive with natural gas. And indeed, we can even foresee that variable renewables coupled with electrolyzers will in the future, by 2050, produce possibly some of the cheapest gaseous fuels we've ever had on the planet. And so we do see a strong future for gaseous fuels of all of the different types, and they are going to be competitive. The reforming plus CCS has a very low learning rate in our model and also in the European Commission's, but with carbon pricing in the European Union, it's still very likely that natural gas will become similarly affected, and thus the opportunity for hydrogen produced from natural gas will manifest itself once the carbon price starts moving further north, and indeed impacting its affordability for industry and consumers alike. Just to say that we're not the only people with our views on how hydrogen, how biogas and how natural gas will evolve. There's a very clear indication from two studies that the European consumption of gaseous fuels will continue well beyond 2050. It is clear that this will no longer be a natural gas only show, that hydrogen will be very, very present. But it is also very clear that we will need natural gas, and we will need natural gas to produce hydrogen. Ecofis, which became Navigant, produced a study in 2019 that basically foresaw around 1,500 terawatt hours, or 142 billion cubic meters of natural gas equivalent of blue hydrogen. So there is still a strong market for blue hydrogen in the Navigant scenario. Trinamics also had a scenario with very strong levels of hydrogen in 2050. And I think we can say that there is a common growing sense that indeed within the European Union, we are in a position where we can say we will see a strong gaseous fuel, and natural gas will be part of it. As I mentioned, we do indeed deliver the overall costs of this energy transition in Europe much, much more cost effectively through the Eurogas scenario, saving 4.1 trillion euros. And we can also say that the direction of travel that we take is in line with the European Commission's own 2030 strategy, which requires a reduction of carbon of around about 55% in 2030. I would like to conclude once again by thanking you for the opportunity to present Eurogas's views on the future of natural gas in Europe. There is a strong future for natural gas. It is going to be different from today, but we will work with our partners to make sure that we're able to deliver the fuels that we need to deliver carbon neutrality in Europe. We will not be able to do this alone. We will need to do it with the support of our neighbours around us. We will still need the premium quality natural gases that we receive from our partners, and ultimately we will be able to help to work together to deliver hydrogen from that natural gas. Thank you again for your attention here today. I hope very much that we'd have the opportunity in the future to meet in person. And I would hope, again, that once the pandemic has come to an end, we would have the opportunity to answer the questions in person on our views. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to speaking to you all very shortly.